Sometimes the people who should stand by you are the first ones to walk away. When 61-year-old Barrett Cole inherited his grandfather's old estate, his entire family turned their backs on him. They said the inheritance was unfair. Barrett just saw a falling-apart mansion he didn't want. The house sat alone in the woods, abandoned for years, with broken windows and vines covering the walls. Barrett had already lost his marriage and the closeness he once had with his children. He didn't need more trouble. But when he walked through those empty rooms, he found something hidden: old letters, photographs, and records tucked behind the walls. His grandfather had kept a secret, something the family had buried on purpose. What was hidden in that house that no one wanted him to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Barrett Cole had never imagined his life would look like this at 61. The small apartment he rented on the east side of town felt more like a waiting room than a home. 2 bedrooms, though he only needed 1. A kitchen he barely used. Furniture that came with the place, nothing personal except for a few photographs on the bookshelf. His children when they were young, smiling and unaware of how distant they would all become. He worked as a construction supervisor for a regional building company, the same job he'd held for nearly 20 years. Good pay, decent benefits, nothing remarkable. He woke at 5:30 each morning, made coffee in the same chipped mug, and drove to whatever site needed his attention that day. The work was physical enough to keep him tired, repetitive enough to let his mind wander. The divorce had been finalized 2 years ago, not bitter, just sad. He and Patricia had simply run out of things to say to each other. 32 years of marriage had dissolved into polite signatures on legal documents. She'd moved to Arizona to be closer to her sister. They texted occasionally, mostly about the kids. Iris, his daughter, was 34 now. She worked in marketing for a tech company in the city, lived in a renovated loft with her teenage daughter. She was successful, independent, and hadn't called Barrett in 4 months. Not out of cruelty, he thought, but out of busyness. Or maybe indifference. He wasn't sure which hurt more. Graham, his son, was 31. He'd moved to the coast after college and stayed there. Married, 2 young children. Barrett had only met twice. Graham sent Christmas cards with family photos, but the phone calls had stopped years ago. Barrett told himself it was natural that children grew up and built their own lives. But late at night, alone in that quiet apartment, he wondered if he'd failed them somehow. His grandfather's funeral had come as a surprise 3 weeks ago. Barrett hadn't known the old man was sick. Nobody had told him. The funeral was small, held at a church Barrett didn't recognize in a town 2 hours away. He'd sat in the back pew, watching relatives he barely knew weep and embrace. His father had died when Barrett was 23, so the connection to his father's side of the family had always been thin. After the service, the lawyer had gathered everyone in the church basement for the reading of the will. Barrett remembered the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of stale coffee, the rows of folding chairs. His uncle, his father's younger brother, sat in the front row with his wife. 2 cousins Barrett hadn't spoken to in a decade sat nearby. An aunt he vaguely remembered from childhood gatherings. Maybe 15 people total. The lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 50s, had opened a manila folder and begun reading in a monotone voice. Small bequests to various relatives, a few $1,000s here and there. Some personal items distributed among the grandchildren. Then came the part that changed everything. To my grandson, Barrett Cole. I leave the entirety of my estate located at 1247 Hollowbrook Road, including the main house, all outbuildings, and the surrounding 43 acres, along with all contents therein. The room had gone silent. Barrett remembered looking up from his hands, confused. The estate? He hadn't even known his grandfather still owned property. The old man had been living in a nursing home for the past 5 years. His uncle had stood up immediately. That can't be right. The lawyer had looked over his reading glasses. It's quite clear, I'm afraid. The property, in its entirety, goes to Barrett Cole. Why him? His cousin had demanded. What about the rest of us? The lawyer had simply folded the document. Those were his wishes. Barrett had tried to speak, to say he didn't understand, that there must be some mistake, but his uncle had turned on him with a look of pure fury. You must have manipulated him, convinced him somehow. I barely knew him, Barrett had said quietly. I haven't seen him in years. Exactly, his aunt had hissed. None of us knew him well, so why you? There had been no answer to that question. The lawyer had handed Barrett an envelope containing the deed, a set of keys, and an address. The other relatives had filed out of the room without looking at him. His uncle had paused at the door. Don't think this is over, he'd said. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Barrett's phone had gone quiet. Texts went unanswered. Calls went to voicemail. Even Iris, who'd attended the funeral, had stopped responding. He'd tried to explain that he hadn't asked for the inheritance, hadn't even wanted it, but nobody seemed interested in listening. The isolation had deepened, the hollow feeling that had lived in his chest since the divorce. He'd never been good at making friends. Work colleagues were friendly, but distant. His evenings were spent alone, eating simple meals and watching television he didn't care about. The inheritance felt like another burden he hadn't asked for. A crumbling estate in the middle of nowhere that probably needed tens of thousands of dollars in repairs. He'd considered just signing it over to his uncle, letting the family divide it up and be done with the whole mess. But something had stopped him. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe, deep down, he wanted to understand why his grandfather had chosen him. So, on a grey Saturday morning in late October, Barrett had loaded a duffel bag into his truck and driven out to see the place for himself. The drive took him through the outskirts of the city, past suburbs that thinned into farmland, and finally into dense woodland. The GPS had guided him down increasingly narrow roads until he turned onto an unmarked gravel drive that wound through towering oaks and maples. Autumn leaves covered the ground in thick drifts of red and gold. After half a mile, the trees opened up, and Barrett saw it. The mansion stood like something from another era, Gothic revival architecture, all steep gables and pointed arches, 3 stories of grey stone covered in climbing ivy, a wide front porch with ornate columns, several of them cracked. Windows, dozens of them, many broken or missing entirely. The roof sagged in places, shingles scattered across the overgrown lawn. It should have been beautiful. Barrett could see that. The bones of something grand were still there. But time and neglect had turned it into something haunted and sad. He parked his truck in what had once been a circular drive, now mostly reclaimed by weeds. When he stepped out, the silence was absolute, except for the wind moving through the trees. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, no signs of life. Barrett stood there for a long moment, keys in his hand, looking up at the house his grandfather had left him. The house his family had cut him off for inheriting. He walked slowly up the front steps, testing each one before putting his full weight on it. The porch boards creaked, but held. The front door was oak, heavy and carved with intricate patterns now softened by decay. The key turned with difficulty in the old lock. The door swung open with a long groan. Barrett stepped inside and stopped, overwhelmed by the smell of dust and mildew and time. The entry hall stretched before him, once elegant, now ruined. A grand staircase curved upward into darkness. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips. Furniture sat draped in stained sheets like ghosts. He stood in the doorway of his inheritance and felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. This house held secrets. He could feel it in the stillness, in the way the shadows gathered in corners. Whatever his grandfather had wanted him to find, it was waiting somewhere in these rooms. Barrett took a breath and stepped fully inside. The air inside the mansion felt thick, as though decades of silence had taken on physical weight. Barrett moved slowly through the entry hall, his footsteps echoing on the warped hardwood floors. Dust motes danced in the weak light, filtering through grimy windows. The parlor opened to his right. He stepped inside, taking in the remnants of what must have once been an impressive room. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved with elaborate designs. Furniture sat in clusters, a sofa with springs poking through faded upholstery, chairs with broken legs, side tables covered in water stains. A crystal chandelier hung at an angle overhead, several of its arms missing. Barrett ran his finger along a bookshelf. The dust was thick as felt. He pulled back a sheet covering what turned out to be a piano. Several keys were missing, and when he pressed one of the remaining ones, it produced no sound at all. He moved through to the dining room. A long table stretched the length of the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs. China cabinets lined the walls, their glass doors fogged with age. Through them, he could see the ghostly shapes of dishes and serving pieces. One cabinet door hung open, revealing empty shelves where something had been removed or had fallen and broken. The kitchen was at the back of the house. Ancient appliances, a massive cast-iron stove, an icebox that predated electric refrigerators, a deep farmhouse sink with a hand pump. Cabinet doors hung askew. The linoleum floor had curled up at the edges. A mouse skittered across the counter when he entered, disappearing into a hole in the baseboard. Barrett climbed the main staircase carefully, testing each step. Several groaned under his weight. One cracked ominously but held. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors. He opened them one by one. Bedrooms, mostly empty. A bathroom with fixtures so old they looked like museum pieces. A linen closet filled with rotting sheets and blankets. At the end of the hall, he found what must have been his grandfather's study. Unlike the other rooms, this one felt intentional, personal. A large desk sat facing the window, its surface clear except for a layer of dust. Built-in bookshelves covered two walls, still filled with volumes. A leather chair, cracked and faded, sat behind the desk. A reading lamp with a green glass shade perched on one corner. Barrett entered slowly, feeling as though he was intruding on private space. He moved to the bookshelves, reading the spines. History, philosophy, literature, books in languages he couldn't identify. Some of the volumes looked expensive, leather-bound with gilt lettering. He was reaching for one when his hand brushed against the shelf itself, and he felt something give slightly. A small section of the bookshelf shifted inward with a soft click. Barrett froze. He pressed against the shelf again, more deliberately this time. The entire section, about 2 feet wide, pushed back a fraction of an inch, then swung open on hidden hinges. Behind it was a compartment carved directly into the wall. His heart beating faster, Barrett pulled the hidden panel fully open. The compartment was perhaps a foot deep and 2 feet across. Inside, stacked neatly, were bundles of papers tied with string that had once been white but had yellowed with age. He reached in and carefully lifted out the top bundle. The string crumbled at his touch. The papers were letters, dozens of them, written in various hands on different types of paper. Some on formal stationery, others on plain notebook pages, a few on what looked like torn scraps. Barrett carried the bundle to the desk and set it down gently. He untied what remained of the string and spread out the letters. They were arranged chronologically, he realized. The dates ranged from 1932 to 1935. He picked up the first letter and began to read. "Dear Mr. Cole, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for the sanctuary you have provided. When I arrived at your estate 3 months ago, I was penniless and without hope. The gallery had closed, my paintings were worthless in this economy, and I had nowhere to turn. You took me in without question, gave me a room, meals, and most importantly, the space and time to continue my work. I am departing now with a commission secured in Philadelphia, but I will never forget what you did for me during the darkest period of my life. With deepest thanks, F.K." Barrett read it again, slowly. Sanctuary. His grandfather had provided sanctuary. He picked up another letter. Mr. Cole, my family and I stayed in your home for 6 weeks while I recovered from the injury that cost me my job at the factory. You asked for nothing in return. You fed my children when I could not. You gave my wife hope when I had none to give her. We are leaving now for my brother's farm in Iowa, but we will remember your kindness forever. May God bless you for what you do. J. R. Another letter to our gracious host. The 3 months we spent at your estate were a gift beyond measure. As a composer whose work was deemed too political, too dangerous, I had fled my home country with nothing but the clothes I wore. You provided not just shelter, but a piano, paper, time, and encouragement. The symphony I completed while under your roof has now been accepted for performance. I owe you my art and perhaps my life. With eternal gratitude, H. W. Barrett sat down heavily in the desk chair, dust rising around him. Letter after letter told similar stories. Artists, musicians, writers, families who had lost everything, people fleeing persecution or poverty or both. All of them thanking his grandfather for taking them in, for providing refuge when they had nowhere else to go. The grandfather, he remembered, had been stern, distant, formal. Barrett had visited this estate only a handful of times as a child, and the old man had always seemed uncomfortable with children, speaking to Barrett in brief, awkward exchanges before retreating to this very study. But these letters painted a completely different picture. Someone warm, generous, someone who had quietly opened his home to desperate people during one of the darkest periods in American history. Barrett spread more letters across the desk, dozens of them, maybe over 100, all expressing gratitude for the refuge, the safe haven, the sanctuary, references to stays lasting weeks or months, mentions of other guests, of shared meals, of artistic collaboration and mutual support. His grandfather had been running some kind of underground shelter during the Great Depression, and nobody in the family had ever mentioned it. Not once. Barrett thought about the hostile faces at the will reading, the anger, the accusations. Had they known about this? Was this why the house had been closed up, abandoned, left to rot for decades? He pulled out his phone and took photographs of several letters. Then he carefully stacked them and placed them back in the hidden compartment. There might be more. There must be more. He stood and looked around the study with new eyes. If his grandfather had hidden this compartment, what else might be concealed in this house? Barrett tried to call Iris. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. "Hey, it's me," he said. "I'm at the estate. I found something important about your great-grandfather. Call me back when you can." He knew she wouldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But that was all right. He was going to figure this out on his own. Barrett looked out the study window at the overgrown grounds, the tangled gardens, the forest pressing in on all sides. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. He decided to stay the night. The house had no heat, no electricity, no running water. But his truck had blankets, and he had a flashlight. He wasn't ready to leave yet. There were more secrets here. He could feel them in the walls, under the floors, behind every closed door. And for the first time in a very long time, Barrett Cole felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose. Barrett woke to pale morning light filtering through the broken blinds of the master bedroom. He'd slept in his clothes on top of the bare mattress, wrapped in blankets from his truck. His back ached from the sagging springs, and his breath fogged in the cold air. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. The house creaked and settled around him, morning sounds of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. Outside the window, fog hung low over the grounds, turning the landscape ghostly and indistinct. He'd spent half the night thinking about those letters, about the grandfather he'd never really known, about why his family had reacted so strongly to the inheritance. None of it made sense yet, but he felt closer to understanding. After a cold breakfast of granola bars and bottled water from his truck, Barrett returned to the second floor. He'd only scratched the surface yesterday. The master bedroom deserved a thorough search. The room was large, dominated by a four-poster bed frame that had lost its canopy fabric to time and moths. A dresser stood against one wall, its mirror cracked diagonally. A wardrobe occupied the corner near the window, its dark wood still solid despite years of neglect. Barrett started with the dresser drawers. Most were empty or contained only remnants moth-eaten socks, undershirts yellowed with age, a few loose buttons. The bottom drawer stuck. He yanked harder, and it came free with a screech of wood on wood. Inside was nothing but old newspapers used as liner, dating back to the 1940 seconds. He pulled them out carefully. Beneath them, the drawer bottom looked oddly thick. Barrett ran his fingers along the edges. There, a slight gap. He pressed down on one end, and the other end lifted up, a false bottom. His pulse quickened as he removed the wooden panel. Underneath lay a leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth with handling. He lifted it out reverently and carried it to the window where the light was better. The leather was good quality, the kind that lasted. He opened it carefully. The first page was labeled in neat handwriting, Guest Registry 1931 to 1942. Barrett turned the page and found himself looking at a detailed accounting system. Columns ran across each page: name, date of arrival, date of departure, occupation, and notes. The entries began in October 1931. The first name, Harold Finch, painter, arrived the 12th of October 2031, departed the 3rd of December 2031, needed studio space and materials, completed series of 6 landscapes. The second, Margaret Foster and 3 children, arrived the 20th of October 2031, departed the 15th of November 2031. Husband killed in factory accident, no family support, arranged position as housekeeper in Boston. Entry after entry, page after page. Barrett turned through them slowly, his amazement growing. This wasn't just a few people helped here and there. This was systematic, organized. His grandfather had been running a full operation. Some stays were brief, a week or two. Others lasted months. The occupations varied widely. Painters, composers, poets, union organizers, teachers, professors, factory workers, farmers who'd lost their land. The notes beside each name told compressed stories of hardship and hope. Victor Laurent, composer, arrived the 15th of March 2033, departed the 2nd of August 2033, fled political persecution in home country, completed symphony in East Bedroom, secured position with orchestra in New York. The Kowalski family arrived the 1st of June 2034, departed the 10th of September 2034. Father blacklisted for union activities, family evicted, children tutored by other guests. Father found work in Chicago. Dorothy Ashworth, writer, arrived the 12th of January 2035, departed the 20th of May 2035. Published work deemed subversive, lost university position, completed manuscript of first novel. Contract secured with publisher. Barrett sat on the edge of the bed, the ledger open on his lap. He pulled out his phone and began searching for names. Harold Finch, the first entry. He found a brief biography on an art history website. Finch had become a respected landscape painter in the 1940 seconds, his work now in several museum collections. His early career was listed as obscure, with a note that he'd found his artistic voice during the Depression years. Victor Laurent. Several entries came up. A composer whose work had been performed by major orchestras. One biography mentioned he'd emigrated from Europe in the early 1930 seconds, found refuge with a private patron, and completed his breakthrough symphony in 1933. Dorothy Ashworth. Barrett found an obituary from 1978. She'd become a notable author, writing about labor movements and social justice. Her first novel, published in 1935, had been controversial but critically acclaimed. No mention of where she'd written it. He searched more names. Not all of them appeared in his searches. Many had probably lived quiet lives, unknown beyond their own circles. But enough came up to confirm what the ledger was telling him. His grandfather had sheltered people who went on to make meaningful contributions to art, culture, and society. People who might have disappeared into poverty or worse without his intervention. And he'd done it quietly. The website biographies mentioned private patrons or unknown benefactors, or simply glossed over those years entirely. His grandfather had asked for no recognition, no public acknowledgement. Barrett stood and walked to the window, looking out over the estate grounds. He tried to imagine this place in the 1930 seconds. Not abandoned and overgrown, but alive. Full of people, artists working in the rooms, children playing in the gardens, families sharing meals, conversations about art and politics and survival. His grandfather moving through it all, quietly making it possible. Why had the family erased this history? Barrett thought about his own father, who died young. Had he known about any of this? Had he disapproved? The family Barrett remembered from childhood had been focused on respectability, on business success, on maintaining appearances. His uncle ran a car dealership. His cousins worked in real estate and finance. This kind of activism, this shelter for controversial figures and labor organizers and political refugees, it didn't fit with the family image they'd cultivated. Maybe they'd been ashamed, or maybe they'd been afraid. The early 1940 seconds entries in the ledger overlapped with World War II. Some of the notes mentioned people fleeing fascism, escaping persecution. That kind of work could have drawn unwanted attention from authorities. Easier to close up the house, never speak of it, and pretend it had never happened. Barrett felt a surge of anger at his relatives. His grandfather had done something remarkable, something brave, and they'd buried it out of embarrassment or fear. He looked down at the ledger in his hands. This was real history. Important history. It deserved to be known. He spent the next hour photographing every page of the ledger, making sure the images were clear and readable. He uploaded them to a cloud storage account, creating backups. Whatever happened next, this information wouldn't be lost. By early afternoon, his stomach was reminding him he needed real food. He'd have to drive back to town, get supplies, figure out his next steps. But as he locked the mansion door behind him, Barrett knew he wasn't done here. Not by a long way. This inheritance wasn't a burden. It was a responsibility. And maybe, just maybe, it was the thing that would give his own life meaning again. He thought about his grandfather, probably sitting in that same study where Barrett had found the letters, quietly helping people while the world fell apart around them, never asking for thanks, never seeking recognition, just doing what needed to be done because it was right. Barrett wanted to be worthy of that legacy. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. Tomorrow he'd come back with more supplies, with proper tools. He'd search every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. His grandfather had left him this estate for a reason. Barrett was beginning to understand what that reason might be. Barrett returned to the estate the next morning with his truck loaded. He'd bought a generator, work lights, cleaning supplies, and enough food and water for several days. If he was going to do this properly, he needed to stay here, immerse himself in the search. The third floor had been unexplored. He'd noticed the narrow staircase leading up from the second-floor hallway, but hadn't ventured up yesterday. Now, with a powerful flashlight in hand, he climbed the steep stairs. The third floor was essentially an attic, though it had been finished as living space at some point. The ceiling sloped with the roofline, and dormers provided natural light through small windows. The space had been divided into several smaller rooms, probably servants' quarters originally. Barrett moved through them systematically. Most were empty except for dust and dead insects. One contained a rusted bed frame, another had built-in shelving along one wall. At the far end of the attic, he found a larger space that must have been used for storage. Old trunks were stacked against the walls. Boxes sat in crooked towers. A dressmaker's dummy stood in one corner like a silent sentinel. He started with the trunks. The first few contained linens, all ruined by moisture and time. The fourth trunk was different. When he opened it, he found it carefully packed with oilcloth-wrapped bundles. He lifted one out and unwrapped it slowly. Inside were paintings, small ones mostly done on canvas board or heavy paper. He spread them carefully on the floor. They were good, some were quite beautiful, landscapes, portraits, still lifes. Each was signed in the corner with initials or brief names: F, K, H, F, D, A, V, L. Names from the ledger, he realized. Barrett sat back on his heels, looking at the paintings arranged before him. These were the works of the people his grandfather had sheltered. They must have left them as gifts, tokens of gratitude. He found more in the other trunks: sketches, watercolors, even a few small sculptures wrapped in cloth. One trunk contained sheet music, handwritten scores with notes in the margins. Another held manuscripts, typed pages of stories and poems, some with editorial marks. But it was the last trunk that moved him most. Inside, wrapped in protective layers of fabric, were paintings of the mansion itself. But not as Barrett knew it. These showed the house alive and vibrant. In one, people sat on the front porch in summer, talking and laughing. Another showed the dining room table crowded with guests, plates and glasses catching lamplight. A third depicted the gardens in full bloom, children playing among the flower beds. One painting in particular caught his attention. It was a portrait of his grandfather, painted in oils on a small canvas. The man in the painting looked perhaps 50, sitting in the study Barrett had searched yesterday. But the face was different from Barrett's memories. Softer, the eyes held warmth and something that might have been sadness. The artist had captured someone kind, someone who carried the weight of others' suffering but bore it willingly. Barrett studied the painting for a long time. This was the grandfather he'd never known, the one who'd written gentle responses to desperate letters, the one who'd opened his doors when the world was closing its own. He set the portrait aside carefully. He would keep that one close. Moving to the boxes, Barrett found more documents. Letters, hundreds of them, similar to the bundle he'd found in the study. These were more personal, more emotional. People writing after they'd left, updating his grandfather on their lives, thanking him again for what he'd done. One letter from 1945. Dear Mr. Cole, you may not remember me. I was 10 years old when my mother and I stayed at your estate in the winter of 1934. My father had been killed, and we had nothing. You gave us a warm room and hot meals, and you never made us feel like charity cases. I wanted you to know that I graduated from university last month. I'm going to be a teacher. My mother says I should write to tell you, because none of this would have been possible without your kindness. Thank you for saving us. Gratefully, P.H. Another from 1952. Mr. Cole, my symphony premiered last week in Vienna. The critics called it my finest work. I thought of you during the performance because you were there at the beginning, giving me space to compose when I had nowhere else to turn. I hope this letter finds you well. You changed my life. V.L. Barrett read letter after letter, each one a testament to lives touched, to trajectories changed, to possibilities preserved. His grandfather had done more than provide temporary shelter. He'd given people the breathing room they needed to survive and eventually thrive, and the family had erased all of it. Barrett felt his anger crystallizing into something clearer. Not just anger, determination. This history deserved to be known. These people's stories deserved to be told. He began organizing what he'd found. The paintings and artwork in one area, the letters and documents in another, the manuscripts and musical scores in a third. He photographed everything, continuing his digital archive. By late afternoon, he'd made his way through most of the attic. His back ached from bending over trunks, and dust coated his clothes and hands. But he felt energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. He carried the portrait of his grandfather downstairs to the study and propped it against the wall where he could see it. Then he sat in the old leather chair and pulled out his phone. He tried calling Iris again. This time she answered, "Dad." Her voice was flat. "Iris, thank you for picking up. What do you want?" "I'm at the estate. Your great-grandfather's house. I've been finding things. Important things. My finding things now was knows that the done fiving times. They vor varsos kan sasa signs. To great-grandfather's house." Silence on the other end. "He was helping people," Barrett continued. "During the Depression. Artists, families in trouble, people who had nowhere else to go. He sheltered them here. Dozens of them over the years. Maybe hundreds." "Okay." Iris sounded unimpressed. "Don't you see? This is why the will was the way it was. He wanted someone to find this, to tell the story. Dad, it's an old house full of old junk. Just sell it and move on. It's not junk. It's history. It's legacy. It's... I have to go. I'm at work. Iris, please, just come see it. Let me show you what I've found. I don't have time for this. Goodbye, Dad." The line went dead. Barrett sat staring at his phone. The rejection stung, but he understood it. Iris had her own life, her own concerns. She saw this as him chasing irrelevant history instead of being practical. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was foolish. He looked up at the portrait of his grandfather. Those kind, sad eyes seemed to look back at him. No. This mattered. Even if his family didn't see it yet, even if they never saw it, this mattered. Barrett stood and walked to the window. The sun was setting, painting the overgrown gardens in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere under that tangle of weeds were the flower beds where children had once played. Somewhere in these rooms, people had found hope when hope seemed impossible. His grandfather had given them that gift. Barrett could honor it by making sure their stories weren't forgotten. He looked around the study, at the stacks of letters and photographs he'd brought down from the attic, at the ledger sitting open on the desk. Tomorrow he'd continue searching. There was still the basement to explore, and he'd barely touched the first-floor rooms. But tonight, he'd sit here in his grandfather's chair and read more of the letters, learn more of the stories, understand more deeply what this place had meant. For the first time since the divorce, since the slow dissolution of his relationship with his children, since the long years of just going through motions, Barrett felt like he was doing something that mattered. Even if he was doing it alone. Barrett spent the next morning in the study, and it was there, while searching through the desk drawers more carefully, that he found the locked drawer. It was built into the lower right side of the desk, and the keyhole was nearly invisible, worked into the decorative carving. He tried several keys from the ring the lawyer had given him. The third one turned with a reluctant click. Inside was a journal. Leather-bound, smaller than the ledger, more personal. Barrett lifted it out carefully and opened to the first page. The 1st of January 1933. "I begin this journal as a record of what I believe is necessary work. The world outside these walls grows darker each day. Men who want work cannot find it. Families go hungry while grain rots in silos. Something in our society has broken, and I find I cannot simply observe the suffering without acting." Barrett turned the page, his grandfather's handwriting clear and precise. The 15th of January 1933. 3 guests currently in residence. Harold continues work in the North Studio. The Kowalski family is settling in. The children are thin, but beginning to laugh again. Mrs. Chen arrived yesterday from the city, her husband having died in a construction accident. She is grieving but determined. I have offered her the east bedroom for as long as needed. Entry after entry documented the daily operation of the sanctuary. His grandfather wrote about practical matters, food supplies, heating costs, repairs needed, but he also wrote about the people themselves, their stories, their struggles, their small victories. The 3rd of March 1933, Harold finished his landscape series today. The paintings are remarkable. He has grown considerably as an artist during his time here. He departs tomorrow for Philadelphia, where a gallery has agreed to show his work. I will miss his company. He plays chess well, and his conversations about art have been enlightening. The 12th of April 1933. Mrs. Chen has decided to train as a nurse. I have arranged for her to begin classes at the county hospital. She says she wants to help others the way she has been helped. I find this deeply moving, but the journal also revealed the costs of this work. The 8th of June 1933. My son visited today. He disapproves of what I am doing here. He called it harboring radicals and wasting the family fortune. We argued. He left angry. I suspect he will not return soon. This grieves me, but I cannot stop what I know to be right, simply to appease those who refuse to see the suffering around them. Barrett paused. That would have been his father. He'd been young then, probably in his 20s. Had he carried that disapproval his entire life? Had it shaped how he'd raised Barrett, kept the family distant from the grandfather? He continued reading. The 22nd of August 1933. The work grows more difficult. Food costs have risen. The heating system needs expensive repairs before winter. My accounts are not inexhaustible. But how can I turn away those who come seeking help? Each person who arrives does so because they have nowhere else to go. I am not a wealthy man trying to buy virtue. I am simply someone who has resources and cannot ignore those who lack them. The 10th of October 1933, Victor completed his symphony today. He played portions of it for all of us on the drawing room piano. Even incomplete, it was beautiful. He wept while playing the final movement. He told me later that he'd thought he would never compose again, that his music had died with his hope. This house gave him back his art. I cannot think of a better use for these rooms. The 3rd of December 1933. My wife's birthday. She has been gone 5 years now. I think she would have approved of what I am doing, though it would have worried her. She always wanted this house filled with people, with life. In a way, I am honoring her memory by making it so, though not in the way either of us imagined. Barrett read on, watching months and years pass. The entries became more reflective, philosophical. The 15th of March 1935. I have been thinking about legacy. What will remain when I am gone? Money passes to heirs who may or may not use it wisely. Property decays. But the lives we touch, the small differences we make, perhaps those ripple outward in ways we cannot measure. The young woman who stayed here last year wrote to say she has published her first story. The composer whose symphony I heard in draft has secured a position with an orchestra. The child who learned to read at this table may grow up to teach others. These are the things that last. The 4th of July, 1936, Independence Day. I think about what freedom means. Not just political freedom, though that is essential, but the freedom to create, to think, to survive with dignity. So many are denied these freedoms by circumstance, by an economy that values profit over people, by a society that looks away from suffering. If this house can provide a small space where some find freedom to be themselves, to do their work, to simply survive, then it serves a purpose greater than mere shelter. Barrett found himself deeply moved by his grandfather's words. This wasn't someone performing charity for recognition. This was someone wrestling with moral questions, trying to live according to principles that cost him dearly. The later entries grew more somber. The 20th of November 1940. The world is at war again. Europe burns. The news brings stories of persecution, of displaced populations, of artists and intellectuals fleeing for their lives. Several have written, asking if I can help. I have said yes. The work becomes more dangerous now. There are those who would question my motives, who would see helping refugees as suspicious or subversive. But what choice do I have? Turn away those who will die if I do not help? I cannot. The 8th of February, 1941. My family has stopped speaking to me entirely. They fear association with my work will damage their social standing. My son refuses to let me see my grandchildren. The isolation is painful, but I accept it. Some things are more important than comfort or acceptance. Barrett set the journal down, his throat tight. His grandfather had been cut off from family decades before. Barrett himself had experienced the same thing. The same conflict, doing what felt right versus what others thought was acceptable. And the mention of grandchildren that would have included Barrett himself. His father had kept him away from this place, from this man, because he disapproved of the grandfather's principles. Barrett looked up at the portrait leaning against the wall. He understood now. The sadness in those painted eyes was loneliness. The weight his grandfather carried was not just responsibility for others, but the loss of his own family's love. Barrett picked up the journal again and continued reading. The 15th of June, 1942. I must close the house soon. The work has become too dangerous. The authorities are watching. Questions have been asked. I will make arrangements for those currently here to find other situations. Then I will lock these doors and leave this place to silence. But I will keep records. Perhaps someday, when it is safe, someone will want to know what happened here. Someone will care that these lives were saved. These people were helped. Someone will understand that it mattered. The entries ended there. The rest of the journal was blank pages. Barrett sat in the study as afternoon light faded. His grandfather had known this history might be buried, had hoped that someday someone would care enough to uncover it. That someone was Barrett. He understood now why he'd been chosen. Not because he was special, but because he was the only one who might care enough to look, to learn, to honor what had been done here. Barrett pulled out his phone and began typing notes. He needed to organize everything he'd found, document it properly, begin to tell this story in a way that would make people understand its importance. His grandfather had given him more than property. He'd given him purpose, and Barrett would not let him down. On his 5th day at the estate, Barrett drove into the nearest town to find the County Historical Society. The address led him to a small brick building on a quiet side street, wedged between an insurance office and a closed-down bookstore. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor polish. Display cases lined the walls, filled with artifacts from the town's history, photographs of Main Street from different decades, agricultural implements, a wedding dress from 1890. An elderly woman looked up from the desk at the back. She had silver hair pulled into a neat bun and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain. "Can I help you?" Her voice was kind, with the slight warble of advanced age. "I hope so. My name is Barrett Cole. I'm researching some local history from the 1930s and 40s. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, standing and offering her hand. "I'm the curator here. Been doing this for 30 years. What specifically are you looking for?" Barrett hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I inherited a property, the old Cole estate on Hollowbrook Road. I've been finding some interesting things there." Mrs. Holloway's eyes brightened. "Oh, the Cole place. I've driven past it a few times over the years. Shame to see it so run down. That was quite a house in its day. Did you ever hear anything about it? About what went on there?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Not much. Your grandfather kept to himself mostly, though my grandmother used to tell stories." "What kind of stories?" "Well, she'd say that during the Depression, the big house helped people. She never had details, just that it was known in quiet circles that if you were desperate, truly desperate, you might find help there. But it wasn't talked about openly. My grandmother said some folks thought it was suspicious, having strangers coming and going. Others thought it was generous. But nobody really knew for certain. Barrett felt a flutter of excitement. "Would you be willing to help me research this? I've found documents, letters, ledgers, records, evidence that my grandfather was sheltering people during hard times. Artists, families, refugees. I think it's an important piece of local history." Mrs. Holloway's expression shifted to one of keen interest. "That would be remarkable if you could document it. We have newspaper archives here. Might be references if we look carefully." They spent the next 3 hours going through microfilm. The local newspaper from the 1930 seconds was thin, only published weekly, focused mostly on agricultural news and social events. But there were occasional hints. A brief mention in 1936, local philanthropist honored for quiet, charitable work. The article was maddeningly vague, but mentioned the Cole name. Another from 1938. Questions raised about transient population. The article discussed concerns from some residents about unknown persons passing through the area, but offered no specifics. A social page from 1934 mentioned a musical evening at a private residence with no names but a description that matched the estate. "It's all very circumspect," Mrs. Holloway observed, "as if people knew something was happening but weren't quite sure what to say about it." "He was protecting them," Barrett said. "The people he was helping, some were probably politically controversial, union organizers, activists. During the Depression, that could be dangerous. And later, when he was helping refugees from Europe, that could have drawn government scrutiny." Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly. "That makes sense. People were afraid in those days. Afraid of communists, afraid of foreigners, afraid of anyone who challenged the status quo. Your grandfather would have had to be very careful." "He was. He kept detailed records but hid them. The house was closed up after the war. The family never talked about any of this." "Why not?" Barrett thought about his father, about the uncle who'd been so angry at the funeral. Shame, maybe, or fear. They wanted respectability. This kind of activism, this association with controversial figures, it didn't fit the image they wanted. Mrs. Holloway removed her glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully. "You know, Mr. Cole, this could be significant beyond just local history. The network of people who helped during the Depression and the war years, we don't know as much about them as we should. Private citizens who used their resources to make a difference. Your grandfather's records could fill in gaps in the historical record." "I want to document it properly," Barrett said. "I want people to know what he did. You should contact the State University. They have a history department that specializes in this era. I know one of the professors there, Dr. Whitmore. He'd be very interested in what you found." She wrote down the contact information on a piece of notepaper and handed it to Barrett. "Thank you," he said. "This helps more than you know. Thank you for bringing this to light. History matters, Mr. Cole, especially the history of ordinary people doing extraordinary things." Barrett drove back to the estate as evening approached. The conversation with Mrs. Holloway had energized him. This wasn't just his personal quest anymore. This was real historical work. Back at the mansion, he made his way to the basement for the first time. He'd been putting it off. Basements in abandoned houses were never pleasant, but if his grandfather had hidden things on the upper floors, there might be more below. The basement stairs were stone, worn smooth in the centers by generations of feet. Barrett descended carefully, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was large, divided into several rooms. An old coal room, still with remnants of black dust coating everything. A laundry area with ancient washtubs, storage rooms with empty shelves. The air was damp and cold. Water had seeped through the foundation in places, leaving dark stains on the walls. The floor was uneven, concrete poured in sections. Barrett walked slowly through the space, his footsteps echoing. Nothing seemed remarkable at first, just the ordinary detritus of an old house. Then, in the farthest storage room, he noticed something odd. When he walked across a particular section of floor, it sounded hollow beneath his feet, different from the rest of the concrete. He knelt and ran his hands over the surface. They're barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, a seam in the concrete, a section maybe 3 feet square that had been cut out and replaced. His heart racing, Barrett went back to his truck for a crowbar. It took him 20 minutes of prying and leverage, but eventually the concrete section lifted up. It wasn't solid concrete at all, just a thin shell disguising a hidden compartment. Inside was a metal box, military surplus, waterproof, designed to protect documents. Barrett lifted it out carefully. The box was heavy, packed full. The lid was sealed with wax that had hardened over the decades. He carried it upstairs to the study, placed it on the desk under the worklight, and carefully broke the seal. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth. Barrett unwrapped them with shaking hands. The first thing he saw was a list of names, dozens of them, but these were different from the ledger entries. These names were marked with dates from 1939 to 1941. Beside each name were notations: arrived from Hamburg, fled Berlin, family of 4 from Vienna. Barrett's breath caught. These weren't just people seeking shelter from poverty. These were refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Beneath the list were letters, some in English, some in German, some in languages Barrett couldn't identify, all expressing desperate gratitude for help with escape, with passage, with survival. His grandfather hadn't just sheltered people, he'd helped rescue them. The scope of what Barrett had uncovered suddenly felt overwhelming. This was bigger than he'd imagined, more important, more dangerous in its time, and his family had buried it all. Barrett sat in the darkening study, surrounded by evidence of his grandfather's courage, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This story had to be told, whatever the cost. Barrett spent the next 2 days photographing and cataloguing everything from the metal box. The documents painted a picture that was both inspiring and sobering. His grandfather hadn't worked alone. The letters referenced the network, a loose coalition of private citizens, clergy members, and sympathetic officials who had helped people escape Europe in the years leading up to and during the early war. One letter, dated August 1939, just before the war began in Europe, laid it out clearly. Mr. Cole, your assistance has been invaluable to our efforts. The 3 families you sheltered last month have safely relocated. We have more coming. The situation grows more desperate by the day. Those who can see what is coming are trying to get out, but the official channels are overwhelmed or closed entirely. People like you, willing to provide temporary sanctuary and financial assistance, are literally saving lives. The authorities may not understand what we are doing. Some may view it with suspicion, but history will judge us by whether we acted when action was needed. Another document was a map, hand-drawn, showing connections between safe houses across 3 states. The Cole estate was marked as a primary location, with lines connecting it to other sites. Some were labeled with names Barrett didn't recognize. Others were marked only with initials. Financial records showed substantial sums paid for ship passages, train tickets, legal fees for immigration paperwork. His grandfather had spent a fortune on these rescue efforts. One ledger entry from 1940 made Barrett's throat tighten. The Levin family, mother, father, 2 daughters ages 8 and 11, arrived from Hamburg via New York. Father was university professor, dismissed and threatened. Family stayed 4 months while arrangements made for passage to California. Girls taught English by other guests. Mother helped with cooking. Father wrote letters seeking academic position, eventually secured teaching role in Los Angeles, departed the 15th of June, 1940. Father's gratitude profound, said we saved not just lives but futures. Barrett searched online for the Levin name and professor and Los Angeles and 1940 seconds. After several tries with different combinations, he found an obituary from 1982. Dr. Isaac Levin, Professor Emeritus of Mathematics, survived by wife and 2 daughters, both educators. The obituary mentioned his escape from Germany, with the help of an anonymous benefactor who he credited with saving his family. Those 2 daughters, now in their 80s if still alive, owed their entire lives to his grandfather's courage. Another document stopped Barrett cold. It was a telegram, dated November 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. Stop immediately. Stop government inquiries. Stop association with refugees considered suspicious. Stop risk to your safety. Stop close operation. Stop. His grandfather had been under investigation. The FBI or some other agency had been watching him. In the climate of the times, helping refugees could be seen as subversive, potentially dangerous to national security. A handwritten note was attached to the telegram. I will complete arrangements for those currently here, but I must close the house. The risk has grown too great, not for myself, but for those I help. If I am arrested, it would bring attention that would endanger the entire network. I will seal the records and hope that someday, when the world has changed, someone will understand what we tried to do. That was why the house had been abandoned, why the family had erased this history. In the 1940 seconds and 50 seconds during the Red Scare and the early Cold War, having a history of harboring controversial figures and refugees could destroy a family's reputation, or worse. His father would have been in his 20s or 30s then, old enough to understand the potential danger, old enough to decide the safest course was to close the house, never speak of it, and hope the past stayed buried. Barrett sat back, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a story of Depression-era charity. This was about rescue operations during one of history's darkest periods. His grandfather had been part of an underground network that saved lives while operating under government suspicion. The historical significance was enormous. But so were the implications for his family. His uncle and cousins had grown up knowing, or at least suspecting, that there were secrets in the family's past. Secrets that could be dangerous if revealed. They'd spent their lives maintaining distance from those secrets, building respectable identities far removed from any hint of controversy. And now Barrett was about to drag it all into the light. He understood their anger better now. This wasn't just about an inheritance, it was about fear that the past would come back to haunt them. But that fear didn't justify erasing the truth. Barrett pulled out his phone and called the number Mrs. Holloway had given him. A secretary answered, and Barrett asked to speak with Dr. Whitmore. May I tell him what this is regarding? Local history, the 1930 seconds and 40 seconds, evidence of a private sanctuary and rescue operation. There was a pause. Please hold. A moment later, a male voice came on the line. This is Dr. Whitmore. Barrett explained who he was and what he'd found. He tried to keep it brief, but the professor interrupted with questions. Where exactly was the estate? What kind of records? How many people? Mr. Cole, if what you're describing is accurate, this is extremely significant. There's been very little documentation of private rescue efforts in this region. Most of what we know comes from coastal cities or from official refugee organizations. A functioning sanctuary and part of a broader network that could fill major gaps in our understanding. I'd like to have it properly documented, Barrett said. Before, he paused. Before my family tries to stop me. They oppose this. They're not happy I inherited the property, and when they find out what I'm revealing, they'll be even less happy. Dr. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Mr. Cole, I appreciate your commitment to historical truth, but I should warn you, this kind of revelation can be complicated. There may be living people connected to this history who have reasons for keeping it quiet. Political reasons, personal reasons. You need to be prepared for pushback. I understand. That said, If you're willing to proceed, I'd like to bring a team out to assess your findings. We can help with proper archival methods, historical context, authentication. Would this weekend work? Barrett agreed and gave him the address. After he hung up, Barrett sat in the quiet study. The portrait of his grandfather gazed down at him from where it leaned against the wall. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," Barrett said aloud to the empty room. The house settled around him, old wood creaking. For a moment, Barrett could almost imagine he heard voices, echoes of all the people who'd found refuge here. Artists and activists, families and fugitives, the desperate and the determined. They deserved to be remembered. Their stories deserved to be told. Whatever came next, Barrett would see this through. He pulled out his laptop and began drafting an email to the local newspaper. If he was going to do this, he might as well start building public awareness. The more people who knew about this history, the harder it would be for anyone to suppress it. He wrote carefully, choosing his words with precision. He explained the discovery, the historical significance, the human stories behind the documents. He offered to provide interviews and access to materials. Before he could second-guess himself, he hit send. Then he called his daughter again. This time, he left a voicemail. "Iris, it's Dad. I know you think this is foolish, but I need you to understand something. Your great-grandfather saved lives. Real lives. He risked everything to help people when no one else would. I'm going to tell that story, and I'm going to make sure the estate honors his legacy. I hope you'll eventually understand why this matters. I love you." He ended the call and sat in the gathering darkness. The die was cast. There was no going back now. Dr. Whitmore arrived on Saturday morning with 3 graduate students, all carrying equipment cases and cameras. Barrett met them at the front door, suddenly aware of how disheveled he must look after a week of living rough in the mansion. The professor was younger than Barrett expected, maybe early 50s, with graying hair and intense eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He shook Barrett's hand firmly. "This is quite a place," he said, looking up at the facade. "Gothic revival, isn't it? 1,880 seconds construction." "I'm not sure of the exact date," Barrett admitted. "I'm still learning about it myself." "Well, let's see what you've found." Barrett led them to the study. He'd organized everything as best he could, the letters in chronological order, the ledgers open to significant pages, the documents from the basement arranged on the desk. The portrait of his grandfather presided over it all from its place against the wall. Dr. Whitmore put on cotton gloves before touching anything. He examined the ledger first, turning pages slowly, occasionally murmuring to himself. The graduate students photographed everything with professional cameras, taking notes on tablets. "This is extraordinary," the professor said after 20 minutes. "The detail, the scope. And you say there are letters as well?" Barrett showed him the bundles. "Doctor," Whitmore read several, his expression growing more absorbed. "Mr. Cole, do you understand what you have here? This isn't just local history. This documents a piece of the broader resistance effort, private citizens creating networks to help refugees. We've known such networks existed, but documentation has been sparse. Most people destroyed records out of fear. Your grandfather preserved his. He hid them," Barrett said. "He knew they might be dangerous." "Smart man." Dr. Whitmore looked at the portrait. "May I ask, what was your relationship with him?" "I barely knew him. My father kept us apart. I saw him maybe 5 times growing up. He seemed stern, distant. I never imagined any of this." "And your family? How do they feel about you revealing this history?" Barrett's jaw tightened. "They're not speaking to me. They think the inheritance was unfair. And I suspect when they learn I'm making this public, they'll be furious. Because it contradicts the family image they've built?" "Exactly." Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly. "I've seen this before. Families whose ancestors did controversial things, even noble things, sometimes prefer to bury that history rather than risk association with it, particularly if those actions involved politics or activism. One of the graduate students, a young woman with dark hair, spoke up. "Dr. Whitmore, I think you need to see this." She'd been examining the documents from the basement. Now she held up a list of names. Several of these people became quite prominent after the war. This one, she pointed, founded a major cultural institution. This one became a noted civil rights activist. This one was a composer whose work is still performed today. Dr. Whitmore came over to look. His eyebrows rose. "You're right. This is remarkable. The people your grandfather helped went on to make significant contributions to American culture and society. He gave them the chance to survive," Barrett said quietly, "to keep doing their work. More than that, he gave them hope when hope was in short supply." The professor turned to Barrett. "This needs to be preserved properly, archived, researched, eventually made available to scholars. Would you be willing to work with the university on that?" "Yes, that's what I want. It will take time, months, possibly longer. We'll need to verify documents, conduct oral histories with any surviving individuals or descendants, piece together the full story." "I understand. And Mr. Cole, once this becomes public, and it will, you need to prepare for attention. Media attention, possibly legal challenges from your family, people coming forward with their own connections to the story. Are you ready for that?" Barrett thought about his quiet life, his construction job, his empty apartment, his estranged children. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." They spent the rest of the day going through materials. The graduate students took hundreds of photographs. Dr. Whitmore conducted a recorded interview with Barrett, documenting how he'd discovered everything, what he knew of his grandfather's life, what his plans were for the property. As the afternoon wore on, Barrett's phone began ringing. He'd turned off the sound, but he could see the calls coming in. His uncle, 2 cousins, numbers he didn't recognize. Finally, he stepped outside to check his voicemail. The first message was from his uncle, voice shaking with rage. "You had no right to go digging into the past, no right to drag this family through the mud. I'm getting lawyers involved, Barrett. You won't get away with this." The second was from a cousin. "I can't believe you're doing this. Do you have any idea what kind of attention this will bring? Our father's business, our reputations, you're going to destroy everything out of stubbornness." There were 5 more messages, all in the same vein. Anger, threats, accusations. But the last message was different. "Dad, it's Iris." Her voice was subdued. "I saw the article, the preliminary piece the newspaper posted online. I read it. I didn't know any of this. About great-grandfather. About what he did. I need to think about this. But maybe you were right. Maybe this does matter. Call me when you can." Barrett stood on the front steps, looking out over the overgrown grounds, and felt something loosen in his chest. Iris had called. She'd read the article. She was thinking about it. Maybe reconciliation was possible after all. Dr. Whitmore emerged from the house. "Mr. Cole, we're finishing up for today, but I wanted to discuss next steps." They talked for another hour. The university would partner with Barrett to establish a foundation. The estate would be designated as a historical site. Restoration work would begin to stabilize the structure. Eventually, part of the house would become a small museum and educational center. "Your grandfather's work didn't end in 1942, Doctor," Whitmore said. "You're continuing it in a different form, providing sanctuary for this history, making sure these stories survive." After the professor and his students left, Barrett went back inside. The house felt different now, not just abandoned and sad, but purposeful, waiting. He climbed the stairs to the master bedroom and stood looking out the window as the sun set. Tomorrow the newspaper would publish a fuller article. The story would spread. There would be interviews, more attention, probably more conflict with his family. But there would also be people, descendants of those his grandfather had helped, historians interested in the truth, maybe even his own children coming to understand why this mattered. Barrett had spent years drifting, going through motions, feeling disconnected from everything and everyone. Now, for the first time since the divorce, since losing closeness with Iris and Graham, he felt anchored. His grandfather had left him this place not because he was special, but because he was the one who would care, who would look beyond the decay and see the meaning underneath, who would honor the past instead of burying it. Barrett pulled out his phone and called Iris back. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, thank you for calling," he said. "Thank you for reading the article. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of answers. Will you come see the house? Let me show you what I found." There was a long pause. Then, quietly, "Yes, I think I will." "This weekend?" "This weekend." They talked for a few more minutes, tentative but genuine. When Barrett hung up, he was smiling. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it entirely alone. The newspaper article appeared on the front page Tuesday morning. Barrett bought 3 copies at the general store in town, spreading one open on the hood of his truck to read. Local mansion hid secret sanctuary during Depression and war years. The headline stretched across the top of the page. Below it was a photograph of the estate, and next to that a reproduction of his grandfather's portrait from the study. The article was thorough. The reporter had interviewed Barrett at length, and Dr. Whitmore had provided historical context. There were excerpts from letters, names from the ledger, descriptions of the rescue network. The piece explained how the Cole estate had served as a refuge for dozens of people over more than a decade, and it mentioned, carefully but clearly, that the family had deliberately obscured this history for decades. Barrett's phone started ringing before he made it back to the estate. The first calls were from other newspapers. A regional daily wanted to do a longer feature. A magazine was interested in a profile. National outlets began reaching out. This was the kind of human interest story that resonated widely. But there were other calls too. An elderly woman who said her mother had stayed at the estate in 1934. A man whose grandfather had been a composer sheltered there. A genealogist working on a family tree that connected to one of the names in the ledger. Barrett took notes, promised follow-up conversations, felt overwhelmed by the response. Then came the call that made him pull over to the side of the road. "Mr. Cole, my name is Ruth Adler. I'm calling from New York. I believe your grandfather saved my family's lives." Her voice was strong. Despite her age, she told him she was 91. "My family, my parents, my older sister, and me, we arrived at your grandfather's house in October of 1938. I was 7 years old. We had fled from Vienna. My father was a professor, Jewish, and the situation had become impossible. We made it to New York, but we had no money, no connections, nowhere to go. Someone in the refugee community told us about a network that helped people. We were sent to your grandfather's estate." Barrett listened, his eyes filling with tears. "We stayed 4 months, she continued. Your grandfather gave us rooms on the 2nd floor. My sister and I shared a room with yellow wallpaper. I still remember that yellow wallpaper. The other guests taught us English. Your grandfather bought us winter coats. He paid for my father to travel to interviews for teaching positions. On Christmas, even though we were Jewish, he gave us presents. Small things, but we had nothing. Those presents meant everything. Did you—" Barrett had to clear his throat. "Did your family survive the war?" "Yes. Because of your grandfather, we survived. My father found a position at a college in Ohio. We moved there in February 1939. My sister became a doctor. I became a teacher. We both married, had children. I have 5 grandchildren now, Mr. Cole. 5 grandchildren who exist because your grandfather helped us when we had nowhere else to turn." Barrett couldn't speak. "I read the article online this morning," Ruth continued. "I've been trying to find out what happened to your grandfather for years, but I never knew enough details. Just that the house was somewhere in your state, that the man's name was Cole. When I saw the article, I knew. I remembered." "Thank you," Barrett managed. "Thank you for calling, for telling me. No, Mr. Cole, thank you for honoring his memory, for making sure people know what he did. We tried to find him after the war to thank him properly, but the house was closed. We thought perhaps he had died. It broke my mother's heart that she never got to thank him one more time. They talked for 20 more minutes. Ruth had documents, old photographs, a letter her father had written to his brother mentioning the kind man who sheltered us, even a child's drawing she'd made of the mansion. "I'd like to donate these to your museum," she said. "If you're creating one." "We are. And yes, please, that would be wonderful." After they hung up, Barrett sat in his truck on the side of the road and wept. He wept for his grandfather, who had died without knowing that the people he'd helped still remembered him. He wept for Ruth and her family, for all they'd survived. He wept for the connection that had been broken and was now being restored. When he finally drove back to the estate, there was a car in the driveway he didn't recognize. As he pulled up, his uncle stepped out of the driver's seat, followed by two of Barrett's cousins. His uncle's face was red with anger. He strode toward Barrett as soon as he got out of the truck. "You've gone too far," his uncle said, voice shaking. "That article is slander. You made our family look like we were hiding something shameful." "You were hiding something," Barrett said calmly. "Something important. It was family business. Private business. You had no right to air it publicly. It's not just family business. It's history. It matters." His cousin stepped forward. "You're destroying our reputations. Do you understand that? People are asking questions about why we kept it quiet, about what else we might be hiding. Maybe they should ask those questions." His uncle's hands clenched into fists. "I'm filing a lawsuit. The will was invalid. You manipulated a dying man. This property should be divided among all of us, and when it is, the first thing we'll do is burn every scrap of paper in that house." Barrett felt something harden inside him. "You won't, because I have copies of everything. Digital archives. The university has copies. The Historical Society has copies. You can't erase this anymore. You self-righteous." "I found the original deed," Barrett interrupted, "with grandfather's handwritten notes. He specifically wanted this property used for humanitarian purposes, for continuing the work he started. I've already filed paperwork to establish a foundation. The property will never be sold or divided. It's going to be a historical site, a museum, and an educational center. That's what he wanted, and that's what's going to happen." His uncle stared at him, speechless. "Now I'd like you to leave," Barrett said quietly. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." For a moment, he thought his uncle might actually attack him, but instead, the older man turned and stalked back to his car. "This isn't over," he shouted before slamming the door. Barrett watched them drive away, his heart pounding. Maybe it wasn't over, but Barrett had won this round. Barrett stood alone in the driveway, watching dust settle where his uncle's car had disappeared down the gravel road. His hands were shaking, adrenaline still coursing through his system from the confrontation. He took a deep breath and walked back toward the house. As he reached the front steps, another car appeared at the end of the drive. This one he recognized Iris's silver sedan. She parked next to his truck and got out slowly. She looked uncertain, her arms wrapped around herself despite the mild weather. "Dad." "Iris, you came. I said I would." She looked up at the mansion, taking in the crumbling facade, the overgrown gardens. "This is it? This is it." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Iris said, "He was. He is. He threatened to sue me." Iris frowned. "Over the inheritance?" "Over everything. The article, the attention, making the family history public. He thinks I'm destroying their reputation." "Are you?" Barrett looked at his daughter. "I'm telling the truth. If that damages reputations that were built on hiding the truth, then maybe those reputations deserve to be damaged." Iris studied him for a long moment. "That doesn't sound like you. You've always been the one who kept quiet, who didn't make waves. Maybe I was tired of being quiet." She nodded slowly. "Can I see it? What you found?" Barrett led her inside and up to the study. He'd organized everything carefully, creating a chronological narrative through the documents. He started at the beginning, showing her the first letters from 1932, explaining what each piece meant. Iris picked up the ledger, turning pages carefully. "All these people," she said quietly. "He helped all these people for more than a decade, quietly, without asking for recognition." She moved to the letters from the basement, the ones about refugees. Barrett watched her read, saw her expression change from curiosity to something deeper. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I knew great-grandfather was wealthy, that there was some old property, but nobody ever talked about him. It was like he didn't exist. Your grandfather, my father, was ashamed of him, or afraid of him, or both. He kept us away from here, from this history. Why? Because in the 1940 seconds and 50 seconds, helping refugees and activists could be dangerous. It could bring government scrutiny, ruin careers, destroy social standing. So the family closed the house and pretended none of it had ever happened." Iris set down the letter she'd been reading and looked at the portrait of her great-grandfather. "He looks kind. I think he was. I wish I'd known him." "So do I." They spent the next hour going through everything. Barrett showed her the artwork from the attic, the music box, the journal entries. He told her about Ruth Adler's phone call, about the other descendants who'd been reaching out. When they finally sat down in the worn chairs in the study, Iris said, "I'm sorry, Dad." "For what?" "For cutting you off. For being angry about the inheritance. I don't know what I thought. That you were being selfish, maybe, or that you'd somehow manipulated things. I believed what Uncle Paul said. He was wrong. I know that now." She looked around the study. "This matters. What great-grandfather did, what you're doing to preserve it, it matters. I was wrong to dismiss it." Barrett felt his throat tighten. "I've missed you. I've missed you too." Iris reached over and took his hand. "I've been thinking a lot since Mum left. About family, about what's important. I let work consume everything. I stopped calling, stopped visiting. I used being busy as an excuse, but really I was just, I don't know, afraid of being vulnerable, maybe. Afraid of needing people. You're my daughter. You'll always be important to me. I want to help," Iris said. "With the foundation, with preserving this place. If you'll let me. Of course. I'd love that. And I think—" She paused. "He won't answer. We haven't spoken in over a year. Try anyway. Send him the article. Give him a chance." Barrett nodded. "I will." They walked outside together as the sun lowered toward the horizon. The estate looked different to Barrett now, less like a burden and more like a promise. A promise he was finally keeping. "There's going to be an opening ceremony," he said, "in about 6 months, once we've stabilized the structure and set up the first exhibits. Will you come?" "I'll be there. I'll bring my daughter, your granddaughter. She should see this, understand where she comes from." "I'd like that." Iris turned to face him. "I'm proud of you, Dad, for standing up to Uncle Paul, for doing what's right even though it's hard. I don't think I've ever told you that." Barrett pulled her into a hug. She held on tight, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had family again. Real family. Not people connected by obligation or blood alone, but people who understood what mattered. When Iris finally drove away, promising to return the following weekend to help with planning, Barrett stood on the front steps and looked up at the mansion. "Thank you," he said quietly, to his grandfather, to the house, to whatever force had brought him here. For the first time in a very long time, Barrett Cole felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday in April, Barrett stood on the front steps of the estate and watched cars turn into the newly gravelled driveway. The grounds had been cleared, the gardens partially restored. The mansion itself had been stabilized, new roof, windows replaced, foundation repaired. It wasn't perfect, but it was no longer dying. A banner hung over the entrance: Cole Sanctuary Historical Site, grand opening. The first 3 rooms had been converted into a permanent exhibition. Display cases held the letters, photographs, and personal items. The walls featured enlarged images of the people who'd stayed here, along with brief biographies explaining what had happened to them after they left. The ledger sat open in a climate-controlled case, its pages testament to his grandfather's quiet work. Barrett had been anxious about this day for weeks. Would anyone come? Would they understand what this place had meant? He needn't have worried. By 10 o'clock, more than 100 people had arrived. Ruth Adler came, her daughter supporting her arm as she climbed the front steps. She embraced Barrett like family, tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see this house again," she said. "It looks just as I remembered, except happier now." Other descendants arrived throughout the morning. A man in his 70s, whose parents had stayed here in 1935. A woman whose aunt had been a painter sheltered during the Depression. 2 siblings whose grandfather had composed music in the East Bedroom. Dr. Whitmore gave a brief speech explaining the historical significance of the sanctuary and the rescue network it had been part of. Local officials spoke about preservation and education. Barrett stood to the side, uncomfortable with attention, but grateful for the validation. Then it was his turn to speak. He stepped to the microphone set up on the front porch, looking out at the crowd gathered on the lawn. Iris stood in the front row with her daughter, his granddaughter, a bright-eyed teenager who'd spent the last few weekends helping him prepare the exhibits. Beside them stood Graham, who'd driven in from the coast with his wife and 2 children. His son had called 3 months ago, awkward at first, but the conversation had opened a door. They'd been talking regularly since. "Thank you all for coming," Barrett began. His voice shook slightly. "6 months ago, I inherited this property, and I didn't want it. I saw it as a burden, another complication in a life that already felt complicated enough. I had no idea what I was really inheriting." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My grandfather ran this sanctuary for more than a decade. He sheltered artists who couldn't find work, families who had nowhere to go, refugees fleeing persecution. He spent his fortune doing it. He risked his reputation and his safety. And when it became too dangerous to continue, he closed this house and hid the evidence, hoping that someday someone would care enough to find it." Barrett looked at the mansion behind him. "I barely knew him. My father kept us apart because he was ashamed of this history, because helping controversial people, sheltering activists and refugees that didn't fit the respectable image our family wanted to project, so they erased him. They closed this house and never spoke of what happened here. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The people my grandfather helped, they remembered. Their children remembered. Their stories survived, even when the physical evidence was hidden. And now those stories can be told properly, in this place where they began." He saw Ruth Adler nodding, wiping her eyes. "This isn't just about the past," Barrett continued. "It's about what we choose to honor, what we decide matters. My grandfather could have lived comfortably and done nothing. Instead, he acted. He used what he had to make a difference. That's the legacy we're preserving here, not just the historical facts, but the principle behind them. That when people need help, we help. When the world says to look away, we look closer. When it's easier to stay silent, we speak up." His voice grew stronger. "This foundation will support scholarships for displaced persons. We'll partner with refugee organizations. We'll teach young people about this history so they understand that ordinary citizens can do extraordinary things. My grandfather's work didn't end in 1942. It continues here, today, through all of us." The applause was warm and sustained. Barrett stepped back, relieved it was over, grateful he'd gotten through it. Afterward, people toured the exhibition. Barrett watched an elderly man stand in front of a photograph for a long time. then realize it was his father, much younger, standing on these same front steps in 1936. Watched Ruth show her grandchildren the yellow wallpaper that had been preserved in her childhood bedroom. Watched his own granddaughter read the letters with genuine fascination, asking questions about the people who'd written them. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd thinned, Barrett found himself alone in the study. He sat in his grandfather's chair, his chair now, and looked at the portrait hanging on the wall. They'd had it professionally cleaned and framed. His grandfather looked out from the canvas with those kind, sad eyes. "I hope I did right by you," Barrett said quietly. The house was alive again, not with desperate refugees this time, but with their memory, with honor for what had been done here, with commitment to continue the work in new ways. Barrett's phone buzzed, a text from Iris. "Mom called. She saw the news coverage. She's proud of you." Another from Graham. "The kids loved it, Dad. Thanks for including us. See you next month." Barrett smiled and typed responses. Then he stood and walked to the window. The late afternoon sun painted the grounds in gold. The gardens would bloom soon. The foundation was hiring a director and 2 staff members. School groups had already scheduled tours for the fall. This house had been a sanctuary once. It would be a sanctuary again, of a different kind, a place where history lived, where stories were preserved, where people could learn about courage and compassion. Barrett had inherited more than property. He'd inherited purpose, and in honoring his grandfather's legacy, he'd found his own. He locked the door behind him as he left, but he'd be back tomorrow. And the day after that. This was his work now, his mission, his way of making the years ahead mean something. The bronze plaque beside the door gleamed in the evening light. Cole Sanctuary, 1931 to 1942. In memory of those who found refuge here, and in honor of the man who provided it. Barrett touched the plaque gently, then walked to his truck. And for the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid of it.